right? Said no one ever. By now, you may have already invested thousands of dollars and several hours of studying and practicing for the skills required in the pilot practical exam, aka Checkride. So the feeling of pressure is understandable. Here are my 5 best recommendations that made each of my practical exam experiences more manageable and less daunting. First and foremost, I want to start talking about giving the Airman Certification Standards, or ACS, the proper attention it deserves. I know that for many students, this may not be something unheard of before, but how many of us really use it the way this publication is really meant to be used? Don't worry if you admit that you haven't really taken advantage of the information provided in here, because when I was a student pilot, I didn't either. If you still need to get yourself a copy of the ACS, the print version is available typically at around $10, possibly a few dollars more than that depending on where you purchase from, but at anything higher than $15 you would be overpaying. Also, a digital PDF version is downloadable free of charge from the FAA website at faa.gov. Simply type Airman Certification Standards in the search bar and you will get to select the pilot practical exam that applies to you. I will include the FAA's link to this page in the video description below. The ACS is essentially a study guide for the entire practical exam, and it lists all the areas that the examiner could test you on. The examiner is not going to test you on a matter that is not included here in the ACS, so if you familiarize yourself with the contents of this book, you can be assured that you have really minimized the chances of being surprised during your exam. I recommend using the ACS as a checklist rather than a book. Go through each listed item here and check them off as you confirm with yourself that you are proficient in the listed item or skill. Early in the book, we have the table of contents, which is always helpful in getting an overview of all the areas to study and practice for the exam. Each of these areas you will see here will be further explained and described in the following pages. You will notice how some of the listed tasks are followed by some form of lettered code surrounded by parentheses. These are used to indicate if that listed task is applicable to your airplane class, such as an airplane that is single-engine land, single-engine sea, or multi-engine land or sea. Don't let this confuse you too much, as this ACS publication is designed to be referenced for the private pilot checkride in all of these airplane classes. So not all the tasks in the ACS will apply to your checkride. Highlighted in green here explains that the oral questioning will continue throughout the entire practical test, so even when you head out to fly with the examiner, be just as ready to answer any questions he or she may ask during this phase of the exam as well. We predictably begin with the pre-flight preparation phase and all the details that are involved in this section. The content of the ACS is organized and laid out in a table like this, where you have the listed task, such as this one being pilot qualifications. There's the objective, where it gives you an insight of what the examiner will be looking to accomplish in this part of the exam. And below are the details that outline the points of testing in this area. I recommend to go through each of these points individually and check them off as you have studied or practiced them. Up near the top again, highlighted in yellow, are the references, with relevant sources for the knowledge items below. And here it indicates that the Code of Federal Regulations Parts 61, 68, and 91 are relevant. The FAR AIM book would be an ideal source to locate this information, and if you would like to learn more about how to navigate the FAR AIM, I have another video that focuses on that. When you see these long codes preceded by FAA, like this, these usually are handbooks published by the FAA. For example, here you see the code matches that on the cover of the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. The letter B at the end of the code on this cover of the Pilot's Handbook indicates the version of this handbook, since the FAA updates their handbooks every now and then. And lastly here, the AC 68-1 represents for the Advisory Circular 68-1. The 68 correlates to the part number 68. Advisory circulars are basically another type of publication from the FAA that gives guidance and information for various regulations and standards. They could be thought of as an official, informative article on all kinds of important stuff. There are several ACs out there and they range quite a bit on their topics. This one happens to be about alternative pilot physical examination and education requirements. Here is a sample of how I would use the ACS as a guide. Moving on just below, still in the pre-flight preparation area, but now on airworthiness requirements. It is the same layout with the table and its corresponding details. I would go through each of these items here and in general seek any important terminology and learn their definitions, as well as learning how they apply to flying. For example, here highlighted in blue we have using an approved minimum equipment list, abbreviated to MEL. With this point, seek to understand what an MEL is and how it's used, and whether or not your airplane that you are using for your check ride has an MEL. I would like to recommend the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge in researching information for the majority of the items listed out in the ACS. Good news is that this book is also available in PDF for free on the FAA's website. Inside this book, I will look for the pages that are about MELs. The table of contents indicates that we would find this information on page 9-9. Here we are looking at the beginning section about the MEL and getting a glimpse of its purpose, allowing aircraft to be operated with inoperative equipment determined to be non-essential for safe flight. I would continue reading through this section about MELs to learn more about how it applies to flying, as well as verify if the aircraft I am using for the check ride also has an MEL attached to it. I would do this by referring to the pilot's operating handbook for that specific aircraft. Here highlighted in purple also includes some procedures that relate to addressing inoperative equipment, a popular question used in check rides. Remember that the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge includes a glossary towards the end of the book, so I would also read the provided definition of the MEL there. The glossary definition is highlighted here, and I just want to point out a common misunderstanding about MELs since we are on the topic. Although MEL stands for Minimum Equipment List, it is a list of equipment that can be inoperative for various types of flight. When we think of the word minimum, it's usually expected that we consider things that are important and essential, so the title here, Minimum Equipment List, feels a bit counterintuitive and misleading. So just be careful with this terminology if you're asked about what an MEL is during your exam. It's easy to say, be organized, but how would this look like when engaging in a check ride? Here are a few suggestions I use for myself to manage the long list of equipment, notes, and documents. And it's back to the ACS again. It also contains a very helpful practical test checklist which neatly outlines all the items you need to make sure you have ready and accessible starting from the moment you meet with your examiner. There are a few formalities in reviewing your documents even before beginning the actual practical test. This checklist can be found on page A-11 back in the appendix section of the ACS. There are occasional incidents of applicants meeting with their examiner and not being able to begin the test due to lacking any of these items. Examples can include missing an endorsement, forgetting IACRA login details, being short of required minimum logged flight time, etc. These are small but significant details in the mandatory requirements for the examiner to even be able to start the exam with you. If you stick to this list and confirm you have them, the little details will be more difficult to miss, and you can avoid making a poor impression to the examiner. In addition to the listed items in this checklist, here are some of my own additions. I would have a current FAR AIM book. I would have it highlighted and tabbed in a way that makes it easier for me to navigate to important areas within this book. If you are planning to use an electronic tablet, such as the iPad, make sure you have it fully charged and ready to go. You know those frustrating incidents where you thought you plugged in your device only to find out hours later that it wasn't charging at all? Don't let that happen, especially this time. Tablets are generally permitted to be used, however, make sure you still are able to manage all the required tasks without it. Treat it as a device that only enhances your flight performance, not to be fully relied on. Okay? Okay. The Checkride is open book, so go ahead and make good and neat notes for yourself. If you can fit all your notes on a single sheet of paper, including memory items, acronyms, and such, that could be most optimal. If you plan to use a knee board, make sure it's ready to go and organized. This may sound a bit overboard, but also make sure, if you don't do so already, keep a good and reliable writing utensil and a backup one too. Writing down taxi instructions, for example, is a reassuring indication to the examiner that you are serious about situational awareness and complying with the rules, even if you already have the airport layout memorized by heart. Don't put yourself in a situation where if you want to write something down and then your pen runs out, which leaves you scrambling in front of your examiner. I once found myself even running out of ink on my backup pen, so now I'm hoarding 3 pens and a pencil, and even I find myself judging myself over that. But who wants to be looking for a dumb pen while the engine is running, an ATC and an examiner is waiting for you? Speaking of backups, if you have any device that uses batteries, for example noise-canceling headsets or electronic E6B flight computers, spare yourself from a headache and carry around a few extra spare batteries in case you need to replace them too. I'm good at forgetting to bring my own sunglasses, and though it's not the end of the world without them, it may be just another possible distraction from focusing during flying in the exam. As you can see, there's quite a number of items to keep track of, on top of all the studying and practicing you have been doing up to this point. With a large workload, it's easier to understand the potential for simple mistakes and forgetting items. Let's not allow any of the items we need for the Checkride distract us from performing well in the Checkride. Before the examiner arrives, I recommend to lay out all your items in this checklist out on the table in the room you will sit with the examiner, and place the items in an ordered, categorized manner where there would be an area for all the items you need in order to begin the exam, then another area for all the items going to be used and referenced during the oral exam, and another for all your flight equipment. Bear in mind that the items you currently see here are only representing a portion of everything you need for each phase of the testing. Having all the materials and equipment out visibly available and grouped in designated areas out on the table, you can proceed through the stages of the exam and not have to think about missing anything or searching for things. Don't sweat the small stuff, but just have them all in line so you can focus more on answering to the examiner's questions and flight tasks. This can help add to your confidence, which, in most cases, confidence comes a lot from good preparation. So with the ACS having provided all the information on the topics, standards, and documentation involved in the entire Checkride, you can start to understand why the examination process does not have to feel so intimidating. In the beginning, I referred more on other books and guides that were said to be helpful in preparation to the Checkride, and I only partially looked into the ACS. But I later found that the ACS was the most complete and comprehensive in guiding on what to study and prepare for. Good communication is key to success in many areas, not only in flying, but with letting your examiner know how you manage the responsibilities of being a pilot. If you do not understand a question, let the examiner know and ask if they could rephrase their question. Help them help you. There will be questions that have simple yes or no answers or minimal responses, but there will also be more complex questions such as scenario-based ones. Coming to the correct answer starts with correctly understanding the question. Though the examiner is the one giving the test, he or she needs to understand you are capable of the responsibility of a pilot in command. For example, it is expected that you will be briefing the examiner as if he or she were a first-time passenger in an airplane. Be able to give a proper and thorough briefing so they can see how you would be safe and competent to take your own passengers as the pilot in command. When using the checklist, read the task items out loud so the examiner knows you are utilizing it and not just appearing to be looking at it. And be confident in your own pilot decision making. This includes knowing if you would need to postpone the flight portion due to deteriorating weather. The examiner is looking to see you demonstrate this skill and not just taking chances and going for a ride. Remember, there are 3 possible outcomes in a Checkride. First one being, you complete and pass all the required tasks of the exam and get a temporary pilot certificate on the spot. Or you may at any point during the exam ask for what they call a letter of discontinuance. This allows you to stop the exam and plan to carry on at a future time. Appropriate reasons for a letter of discontinuance include such as you or the examiner becomes ill during the exam, the aircraft develops a mechanical problem, or the weather deteriorates to adverse conditions. Keep this in mind that it is up to you to take the proactive step to make this call when it's appropriate. When you do continue the exam at a later date, you will get credit for what you have already covered, so you will not have to repeat what you have already accomplished since you initially began the exam. Last possible outcome is failing. If, for example, the weather conditions worsen, making it difficult for you to perform the maneuvers to standards, it's your responsibility to make the call. Otherwise, if you decide to continue with the exam and end up exceeding the tolerances prescribed in the ACS, the examiner will have no choice but to fail you for the exam. So be the pilot in command with decision making and speak up if a letter of discontinuance is appropriate for your situation. Maintain transparency during your exam. Speak up if you need to correct something during your flight. Although absolute perfection is not expected in the exam, the bigger priority is to demonstrate how you honestly recognize your situation and know how to correct and actually taking corrective action. Communicating this will help the examiner understand your abilities as a pilot. Letting intimidation allow you to avoid asking appropriate questions would be a disadvantage to yourself. Keep it simple. Again, easy to say, but it could be tempting to want to impress the examiner with all your hard work you put into studying and practicing. If the examiner asks a question, it's recommended to keep it short and simple. For example, if you were asked what a magneto is, just respond with its definition only. And if the examiner wants to know more about what you know about magnetos, take it from there. Let the examiner ask you for further details. Do not make your first response include the intricacies of how it works, how many your aircraft has, what happens if you experience a battery failure, and so on. Of course, know this information, but the point is, let the examiner ask you for this information. This is also why I included to first study any terminology and their definitions you find in the ACS list as mentioned earlier in this video. Definitions are simple and often best to start with when studying, and then followed by the further details. It's generally better for the exam to keep progressing from topic to topic instead of getting yourself stuck and dwelling on a particular subject because you gave too much information and the examiner needs to ask more questions than he or she initially planned. This is especially true if you got most of your response correct, but a small portion of it being incorrect or slightly incorrect. So again, minimal responses can help avoid these incidents. And the same philosophy applies to the flight portion of the exam as well. It's just a flight to demonstrate to the examiner you're safe and competent, and we're not about to compete in an air show here. I think this is my favorite tip. Go ahead and take a quick review flight in the local area in the airplane you will be using later for the check ride. Do this on the same day before the examiner arrives. Though you can check the current airport conditions and weather reports, actually going out there to fly around helps to give yourself a preview of the conditions both on the ground and in the air. This can also give you some reassurance towards the check ride flight ahead of you. And it's like a final reminder that you got this. You're capable of flying an aircraft and coming back safely, and only to do it again with the examiner. This also gives you a final chance to make sure your airplane and equipment is performing perfectly and catch any potential discrepancies. So that took a lot longer than I planned for, but I hope this video gave you some ideas in handling your check ride and making it a success. Good luck and I'll see you next time.